In the previous video, we demonstrated how to create a virtualization project on the embedded server, how to create an empty service deployed on some agent, and how to test it. The response we received was empty, and that's because we haven't specified yet any behavior inside the virtual service data model. So let's change it. What we will do is we will create a new rule in the data model editor and import there a couple of sample messages. These sample messages likely come from some analytical documentation, and they can be found in this training zip file linked in the description of this video, which I downloaded here. So these are our sample requests. These are our sample responses. When I open one, you can see it looks pretty much the same as the example that I showed you in the previous video. For a virtual service that you can see here and here in the Service Virtualization Explorer, the data models can be found here in this list as well as here when you drill down through this tree-like structure. A virtual service can have multiple data models. By default, it has just one. You can add a new data model, edit it, delete it, or duplicate it. Having multiple data models means that your virtual service can behave in a number of different ways. Different data models can cover different use cases or versions of virtual service behavior. Besides the data models, we also have these performance models. I will talk about performance models in detail in some other video. What's important to understand, in a virtual service, you have both the functionality and performance under your control. This is where you specify how the virtual service behaves, how it generates responses when it intercepts a request. This is how fast it will generate the responses. In simulation, there is always one data model selected as well as one performance model. This special selection means during this simulation, SV will try to generate the response as fast as possible. I could select a different performance model and restart simulation, and now the simulation would perform using different parameters. When you select none, SV will use the real service to generate response, but it will use the selected performance model to enforce the specified performance parameters. But now let's look in detail into our portfolio suggestion data model. I'll double-click this. So this is the data model editor. This is where you define how your virtual service will behave from the functional point of view. On the left-hand side, there is the operation pane. Many protocols have the operations strictly specified. In case of REST, it's a little bit more flexible. We always start with this special double asterisk operation that handles all potential requests to your REST virtual service. Later, you can create a more detailed organization of your REST virtual service by adding additional URI spaces. If you have a more complex API, it's certainly better to divide the functionality into multiple operations, multiple URI spaces. Depending on what your API does, it could be /view, /delete, /add, different REST operations for which you would define the behavior separately per operation. In this sample service, we'll keep the catch-all double asterisk operation, and we will handle everything in this single operation that I selected. When you create a data model, by default, two rules will get created. The learn data rule, which is currently empty, there is no row, and the default response rule. The default response rule defines how the virtual service should respond if it intercepts a request which it can't fully handle. If in any situation SV doesn't know what to fill into any particular field in response, it will use the default values defined here in the default response rule. We can go here, select this request response pair, and look into it in row detail. And you can see that the default response currently is status code 200, content type text plain, but nothing else, which is exactly the empty response that we received when we tested this empty virtual service. We'll return to this default rule a bit later. Now let's create a new rule to import there the sample requests as specified in this step. The rule should be called samples from documentation. It will be a normal data rule. So I click here, select data rule, and I'll name it samples from documentation. I can create rules either for the selected operation or for all the operations. In this particular situation, that makes no difference. As you can see, there is a new rule now in the data model, positioned below the learned data rule. The order of these rules matter. The higher the rule is, the higher priority it has. And for my samples from documentation rule, I want it to have the highest priority to potentially override whatever is specified in the learn data or the default response rule. That's why I'll click this symbol to increase the priority, and now the samples from documentation has priority number 1. I will expand the rule and let's import the sample messages inside it. After that, I'll explain you the structure of the table. So let's click this white space, select import message. We need to save changes before it. And this is the dialog for importing sample messages. You can either copy it from clipboard or from files or from our message log that I'll show you a bit later. This time we'll use this from files functionality. And inside our sample data, I will select requests 1 through 6 and responses 1 through 6. You can see the content type was automatically selected for me based on the content of these XML files. Additionally, what's required here is to select the post method, because our API will use the post method. So let me select it here. The status code is 200 OK. And that's it. I press OK, as we will analyze which request belongs to which response, because we always import couples, request and response. As you can see, it correctly matched the files that I selected. If not, you can reorder it here. And what's also important for me is to uncheck now this create a track checkbox as required here. And that's because if I keep it checked, as we will think that all these requests come from a single user, that it's some sort of sequence of requests and responses, which is not the case. These are just arbitrary samples from documentation, and there should be no context, so as we shouldn't keep a track of sequence of these calls. That's why I unselected create a track. I'll describe the track functionality a little bit later. Let me click OK, and this will import the rows to my data model. By default, columns are hidden. I'll click here, reset to default, as well as here, reset to default, to see what SV thinks are the most important columns from the business point of view. Expand it a little bit. Let's hide these technical parameters like HTTP input parameters. That's not interesting to us at this moment, so I'll also hide it here. Now you can see something that makes sense from the business point of view. On the request side, you have these columns that should have direct effect on what are the suggested assets this virtual service should return. So here are the suggested assets. We can have a look, like 4, suggested assets in this request response pair. So what you can see is the initial functionality that we imported. If we now test this virtual service with this input, like with the purpose of speculation, risk level of 80 and so on, we will get this response that we imported. So let's test it. We will use one of these sample requests and we'll make sure that the corresponding sample response is retrieved. Keep in mind you have to correctly specify these accept and content type headers while using the REST client tool of your preference. So let me go here and let me perhaps test the virtual service for request number 1. I'll just copy this request, specify it here. The accept header and the content type header have the correct values. The URL still corresponds to my virtual service URL, that's also okay. So when I click send, I will receive this response, which, let me verify, 85, so let me just verify this is response 1. Yeah, 38Y, this is response 1. Now, how you should read this table. So for the selected row, this is the request part, this is the corresponding response part. So these are the values specified for individual columns or fields on the request side. Here the corresponding values on the response side. But that's not all. There is also this special row with functions. You can hide it or display it using this menu. And these functions is how you specify a more sophisticated behavior during simulation. We have two types of function: condition functions and action functions. Condition functions are is and ignore. You can also create custom condition functions, which I'll show you a bit later. And then you have some action functions like set or generate random number, generate a sequence of numbers, and so on. Again, I'll show that in detail a bit later. You should see this data model row as a sort of if-then clause. If these conditions are met, then this row is selected, and if this row is selected, these action functions will get executed, and in this case, these functions will set these imported values as values of your response. Currently, we have is functions selected for all the columns. So if we test the service with something slightly different than, for example, here 50, if we test it with 51, then none of these rows will match because there is function on top of the risk level column, and out of all these if-then clauses, no row will match. And if no row matches, then as we will try to find some instructions in rows with lower priority, and if there is no other rule, there is always the default response rule. So let's test it. Let's go again to our REST client and test it with risk level of, say, 21. I press send, and what I receive is the empty response. And why? That's because in the default response, the no content text plain default response has the highest priority. But in the default response, we always have default values for all the various response types, even for this portfolio suggestion structure. So let me just show this in row detail. So these are the default values that SV automatically generated. So let's test it. Let's move this row a bit higher. Yeah, because the higher the row is, the higher priority it has. It's like with the rules. And by the way, if you record rows from the real service, new rows will get always appended to the top so that the fresh data will get higher priority. So that's why I reordered the rows like this, and now this portfolio suggestion structure has the higher priority. I will restart simulation. Always use this link to Restart Simulation. It's way better than going to the home page of the virtual service and pressing Simulate. So when I reorder it like this and go here, what I will receive is this portfolio suggestion structure that we imported, but with default values. And that's because in this rule, no row matched. The matching is very strict. If you used in this current setup something different than you specified here, then no row will match, no action functions will get executed, no values will get generated from this rule. So as we will try to find instructions in some rules with lower priority, for example in this default response rule, if there is no other instruction in any rule with higher priority, always there is the default response rule with at least some dummy value for the field. So these are the dummy values. It always starts with SimDefault and the field name. When you retrieve a response like this, then your client application will likely fail on that. But that's what you want, because that will signalize that your simulation is not fully realistic. And if your client application doesn't fail on this output, you will definitely see it here. There is a metric called data model accuracy, and that's exactly what expresses how many times the default response was used. So this is really poor. It signalizes that almost all the fields had to be generated from the default response rule. So our current setup is not very realistic, because out of the 3 requests we tested here, only one matched, the other 2 didn't match. So it means that you can't use the virtual service like this. You have to change the setup here so that it performs more accurate, or you need to stick with the exact same values as imported. You can see our data model accuracy increased. So always keep an eye on this metric. It will tell you whether your virtual service is simulating correctly or whether you need to make some changes to make it more realistic. Here in step number 8, we reordered the rows in the default response rule so that the SimDefault values are returned instead of the empty response, but we forgot to set the content type, because the content type, the retrieved one from the default response, is currently text plain, which is incorrect. We need to set it to text XML. Well, restart simulation, go here, press send, and now the content type is correct. Okay, that's step number 8. And in the next video, we'll look into the basic debug capabilities of SV, as well as into how to check progress in these hands-on exercises automatically.